Well, it's a great honor and a pleasure to welcome again to the show Jonathan Kay, a journalist, editor of Quillette, host of the Quillette podcast. Overall, prime example of what good journalism is and should be. How are you today, John?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. It's been a while since we last met, and yeah, yeah, I'm doing all right. It's just enjoying summer here. What's the weather like in Canada now?
Weather is it's pretty hot and muggy. Uh, yeah, I'm looking forward to fall, to be honest.
Oh
It's
yeah, me too. It's
yeah.
Yeah, so the heat is way more intense and more humid here in Hanoi.
I
Uh,
can imagine.
so we're focusing our talk today on your latest Quillette article. It is titled "A Media Field Social Panic Over Unmarked Graves," and it concerns the development of this massive story that broke last year regarding these unmarked graves purported to be of residential school students of Indigenous Canadian descent. But I would like to begin by asking you if you can give us a brief historical lessons for those who are not Canadians and not familiar with Canadian history about your country and its history towards the Indigenous peoples.
Sure. Well, I think it's widely recognized that Canada treated Indigenous people in a fairly racist way. Um, and this included efforts to indigenize, um, to kind of remove the cultural indigeneity of the Indigenous population, preventing them from speaking their ancestral languages, um, and discouraging Indigenous rituals. And in large part, this took place through a system of schools that uh, often they were boarding schools. They were always, the government of Canada didn't run them directly. So this system was set up in the 19th century. Um, they were run largely through Protestant and Catholic churches, and uh, Catholic churches mostly. And Indigenous children would go to these schools. They would be taught English and math and stuff. But at a lot of these schools, there were abuses that took place, including sexual abuses. So some of these schools became very notorious. And in some cases, children were forced to attend these schools against the wishes of their parents. And so the schools acquired a terrible reputation. And now, in recent years, there's been a great reckoning with why did we force all these Indigenous children to go to these schools? So that's the historical background. There's been all sorts of government reports, even in the early part of the 20th century. The government of Canada started to recognize that a lot of these schools had inadequate medical care, and children were dying from things like tuberculosis at unconscionably high rate. So that's the historical background.
I see. I know that recently the Pope Francis recently visited your country and to pay sort of an atonement to what had been going on in the residential school scheme and such. And I would like to hear your thoughts on it because I think that, an apology to the indigenous peoples who have been victimized by this school system that the Catholic Church aided is legitimate and necessary, but nevertheless, his apology came directly as a result of this, well, to quote the title, media-fueled social panic over these unmarked graves. So, yeah.
Yeah. So to understand the Pope's visit, it's important to understand more recent history, starting, I guess, about 14 or 15 months ago. So, as I said, there was this pronounced historical reckoning over the last, I guess, couple of decades, um, where politicians, educators, journalists started to emphasize some of the cruelties that were imposed on Indigenous people through these residential schools. And then the the certainly the journalistic focus on this issue was ramped up in late May 2021 when it was announced quite dramatically that there was this Indigenous First Nation in British Columbia, which is the west coast of Canada, and they said that they had ground penetrating radar data that they said was consistent with finding 215 previously unmarked graves of Indigenous children on the grounds of a former residential school. And this news was quite explosive in the Canadian media, and people extrapolated the idea that these 215 markings in the ground, because that's at the time, and in fact, that's still all we have. These are GPR data lines that are consistent with the possibility that these are graves. The media extrapolated from this that these must be graves. They must be the graves of children. Those children are Indigenous. And furthermore, that those children must have been somehow either murdered or they had been buried in some kind of secret way, which there was some, New York Times said that there was a mass grave, even though I don't, Indigenous bands themselves didn't say at the time that this was a mass grave. The idea of a mass grave summoning to mind like Rwanda or Srebrenica, or like, the idea of, or, a concentration camp from Nazi Germany.
Yeah, the killing fields also is another example.
Right. I mean, there's tragically, human history is littered with examples of killings on this industrial scale.
Mhm.
And the journalistic coverage of this in mid to late 2021 in Canada summoned to mind the idea that there had been some kind of horrific genocide-like massacre of children that had taken place. This was at Kamloops, British Columbia. However, I think there were a lot of people who, including me, were credulous of the story because we just assumed that this story wouldn't be reported if there wasn't going to be more information. So we just assumed that within days or weeks, there would be a full and comprehensive forensic review of the site in question. People wouldn't just be relying on this GPR data, because this ground penetrating radar can pick up all sorts of things. It can pick up backhoe trenches, irrigation ditches, it could pick up search lines from people who were formerly looking for graves, because that area in Kamloops actually has been searched for graves unsuccessfully in the past. But anyway, we just assumed that there'd be more data coming, that people would actually dig in the ground and find evidence of this. But then the months passed and that never happened. And to this day, in fact, no human remains have actually been found. Other First Nations, understandably, responded to the story by conducting some of their own GPR, that's ground penetrating radar surveys. And those surveys, in some cases, have also picked up indicators in the ground that would be consistent with the existence of graves. Although in those cases, they haven't found any human remains either. And to be fair, there's been no systematic process to actually look for those human remains. So the story, this is something I've written about in Quillette and something I've explored in a few podcasts we've done. It's this really weird situation where there was this just massive burst of media activity, focus on this issue in mid to late 2021, with many seasoned journalists just assuming that this was evidence of some kind of mass murder, worse, of mass murder of children. And then when no evidence came to back that up, the media just kind of moved on. And so did politicians. Justin Trudeau lowered the Canadian flag on national buildings in Canada for months. It was a record thing. It's been more than a year and no evidence has been found to back this up. But journalists and politicians don't kind of want to admit that they succumb to any panic. And to be fair, it's entirely possible that the graves, unmarked graves of Indigenous children, will be found on these not. I wouldn't be surprised if they did find some graves. But to this day, no graves have been found. All they found is GPS. Existence of all could be the result of any number of other subterranean factors.
Mhm. Yeah, we'll get to that in a bit, but I want to focus on, well, your knowledge of Canadian history a bit in that. So how much of the Canadian government and its religious authorities treatment of the indigenous peoples were you taught during school when you were at school?
So when I was at school, so I'm 53 years old. I went to school. I went to grade school, elementary school in the 1970s and 1980s. And at the time, there was scandalously little treatment of Indigenous history. And if you look at school texts from that era, and certainly from previous eras in Canadian educational systems, to the extent Indigenous people are spoken of at all, it was that European colonizers came to Canada and hoisted the flag, whether it's of you know, England or France. And yes, there were some Indigenous people here who met them, and they either helped the Europeans or they fought with the Europeans, but they quickly faded into the background. It was kind of like us, very much supporting characters in the drama of European settlement of the Americas. Maybe there was like some of these lessons that I learned, it was like, some very superficial treatment of, oh, they were good at hunting, or they were good at beadwork, or they helped the Europeans forage for local food and stuff like that. But like very little treatment of the way those indigenous peoples were treated and mistreated by these European arrivals. So that was kind of a scandal in and of itself. Now, of course, everything's been reversed. So
Mhm.
kids who are in elementary or middle school or high school as well, I guess on into college, because this has become an obsession in universities, it's very much the opposite. So uh, the subject of Indigenous life in Canada, and especially residential schools and the mistreatment of Indigenous populations, has become a point of enormous fixation within the educational system.
Mhm. Yeah, this is an aside, but I saw a film by Kevin Smith called Tusk. It was in 2014 and it took place in Canada. It was a very terrible movie. I wouldn't recommend it. But
Okay.
there was a moment in that movie where one of the characters mentioned the name of Maurice Duplessis and the Duplessis orphan.
Maurice Duplessis. Yeah, he
Yeah,
was a
Duplessis. Yeah,
long time premier of Quebec.
yeah, and the Duplessis orphans. What did you learn about him? What do you know of him?
So Maurice Duplessis was long serving uh, premier of Quebec, and this was a time when the Quebec was, I don't want to say it was a theocratic society, but it was very much an agrarian, pastoral, highly religious part of Canada, insulated from the rest of Canada and indeed the rest of North America by language, because it was French and remains French. But the rest of the continent is largely English. Duplessis served, I don't know, it was like 4 terms or something like that. It was kind of like the Porfirio Diaz of Quebec in some way, like just led a very, some would say, authoritarian government in Quebec in concert with top-down social control from the church. Education was run by the church, and yeah, and some of the um, abuses that were visited upon Indigenous children at residential schools, as in many other Catholic societies, that kind of thing. There were all sorts of um, scandals and abuses that later came to light about the treatment of children and single mothers and stuff like that in this very religious Catholic society.
Mhm. Yeah. Again, the reason why I ask these questions about history because I'm always fascinated about how in different areas, different countries, they always have a blind spot in teaching about their national history. I mean, my own is a good example. Like you wouldn't find out about the boat people if you study history in Vietnam. And
Right.
I think in America, the discussion, the dialogue about race has been mostly obscured. And right now, there's this wave of so-called reckoning. And in Canada, the similarity, in a similar way, the, the discussion about it, the government's treatment of Indigenous peoples. So I guess my question to you is, in what way is this reaction to the 2021 mass grave scandal um, similar to the Americans' reaction during the George Floyd killing of 2020?
Well, look, so much ink has been spilled about the George Floyd protests. Not sure how much new I can add, except to say that because so many Canadians live on uh, American social media, there tends to be this phenomenon in recent years where something happens in the United States, it completely dominates American social media, and Canadians sort of jump at the chance to present themselves as undergoing a similar social struggle. So, like when the Donald Trump phenomenon was all over the social media of the United States, in Canada, we kind of rushed to imagine that some kind of like Donald Trump phenomenon was going on in Canada, and we started to compare our own politicians, such as Ontario Premier Doug Ford, those accusations. Oh, he's like a Donald Trump, even though the comparison makes no sense. And something similar happened after the George Floyd protests, where there were a lot of Canadian activists who absolutely insisted that race relations in Canada were just as terrible as they were in the United States, and our own police were just as brutal and racist. Even though the numbers absolutely don't support that, but this is what happens when a tiny country like Canada spends its entire time on American social media. And so after the George Floyd protests, there actually was, I think, a liberal or former liberal cabinet minister who explicitly said, "Oh, let's make the residential school thing. Let's make that our George Floyd moment."
Mhm.
In regard to Indigenous, or her name is Carolyn Bennett, I think. Uh, let's make that our George Floyd moment. We can, we can be like the Americans. We can have protests and stuff. And so I think, and just to be clear, the claims of unmarked graves in Canada surfaced in late May 2021, which would be a full year after the George Floyd phenomenon began.
Mhm.
But COVID was still around. There was still all kinds of BLM protests. There were Antifa protests to some extent. So there was still a climate of street activism, stuff like that. And unfortunately, in Canada, thanks to the encouragement of the media and the political class, there was this enormous unbridled anger at what was presented as evidence of child graves, and dozens of churches were burned, including, and this is in purported retribution for these disclosures, and many of these churches were burnt to the ground, and in some cases in Indigenous communities. So these were churches that were used and beloved by Indigenous people. They were burned in this sort of perverse act of retribution by people who had become inflamed by these accounts of child graves.
Mhm. Yeah, I was around Canada. I was studying there when the story broke out, and of course, in correspondence with the Black Lives Matter slogan, there's "Every Child Matters" slogan. And I remember every political figure at that time, I think there was an election, talk about it, conservatives and liberals and even NDPs and Greens alike. And of course, you said that the story broke out in May of last year, and come July 1st of that year, which is Canada Day, there were calls to cancel it. And that and I remember the day that was supposed to be Columbus Day was changed to the National Truth and Reconciliation Day. Um, and I've always thought that the uh, the cancellation of Columbus and Columbus Day is the first, is a, I guess, canary in the coal mine of what we now know today as cancel culture, and this sort of like retroactively canceling historical figures. I wonder if how would you assess this? Were you there when the cancel Columbus Day phenomenon started, and what did you make of it?
I mean, to be fair, so the campaign against Columbus Day, I mean, there was a lot of this. I'm old enough to remember, well, almost old enough to remember the uh, American Bicentennial in 1976, and even then, this is going back almost half a century. Uh, there were people who complained, rightly, I think, that the narrative of the creation of the United States in the popular imagination really did exclude um, indigenous Americans. By the way, the nomenclature has changed, whether Indians or Native Americans or Aboriginals like this. There's no one term you could use that people listening to the podcast now or 5 years from now will regard as current. So I'm just going to say indigenous people. Um, yeah, I think it was quite fair comment, certainly in the latter part of the 20th century, to say that when we talk about what was then called Columbus Day and the narrative of American history, it really did exclude indigenous people, or it presented them as savages or whatnot, sort of as an obstacle to be overcome in the creation of what would become the United States. And I mean, to be fair, like Columbus himself was embarking on a completely colonial project. Like he was looking for riches. He was looking for spices and other gold and other things that could be harvested and brought back to Europe to make his paymasters rich. So I don't think, now we use terms like cancel culture to describe things like the campaign against Columbus Day. To the extent that term fits, I think not everything that gets canceled or critiqued is should be defended. I don't think there's anything wrong with celebrating Columbus Day per se. Relates to an important moment in global history. But when you look back on that, the claims made about Columbus Day and the American attitude toward Columbus and the European arrival in the Americas, it's a lot more valid than some of the criticisms you're seeing now. Because certainly in Canada, the criticisms you're seeing of historical, like, excuse me, statues and stuff like that, these complaints now post-date many, many years of good faith efforts to make history more accurate and to make history more fair and to tell the other side of the story. And in some cases, I think like these things sort of go back and forth, balance and counterbalance. In some cases, we've actually tipped the scales like too far on the other side, where we're kind of, as with the unmarked grave story, we're kind of bending the truth in the direction of vilifying people of European stock. And it's someday the thing will return to the other side of the pendulum, like history moves in cycles like that. So in answer to your question, I don't think it's completely fair to compare the campaign against Columbus Day decades ago with the campaign, say, to insist on this what now seems to be a false narrative about so-called unmarked graves, because one, the Columbus thing really was about creating a good faith, balanced narrative
Mhm.
about European and indigenous historical perspectives. Whereas now what we're seeing more resembles like a kind of religious phenomenon where anybody who disputes these claims made about um, unmarked graves is kind of being denounced in some circles in Canada as sort of a heretic or a denier. Like it's more of a religious movement than a good faith effort to restore historical balance to the consideration of North American history.
Oh yeah. I think it's quite the same too, in that I think Columbus, we shouldn't have a reassessment of who Christopher Columbus was. He, yeah, he basically defrauded the people whose land he was visiting, and overall he was a rather vicious man, at least those to those people. Um, so I'd like to focus on your article now. Tell me about this technology that they use. Was it ground penetrating radar, GPR? I've heard a study that says that it has a pretty wide margin of error. So can you describe to me what it is and how it works?
Yeah, so GPR, ground penetrating radar, is, well, the those words are pretty evocative actually. It's uh it's radar technology that penetrates the ground and gives you an image of the soil disturbances typically that lie under the ground. So, one of the misconceptions that surrounded the use of GPR technology is when people saw that, oh, this GPR data suggests the presence of graves. I think a lot of people just kind of assumed that GPR technology was like sort of an X-ray and that you could see these caskets or skeletons under the ground. Um, that those image of little child bodies that had been thrown into the ground decades ago. But that's not how the technology works. The technology, what you do is you'll sort of do a systematic survey of a patch of land, and I don't know, like you'll kind of run it in a line, and then I don't know, 2 feet or 5 feet, like sort of in the way that you imagine a pattern of a Zamboni going over the ice at a hockey arena
Mhm.
or a lawnmower going over a football field. You'd kind of like go left, right, like you'd march back and forth so that you cover the whole surface in a grid of, I don't know what the typical spacing is, but you're trying to cover the entire area and look at all the soil dislocations that exist under the ground. And I think it typically penetrates a couple of feet under the ground, so you can find what are called soil dislocations, maybe like a foot or 2 feet, or maybe even 4 or 5 or 6 feet under the ground. You're not going to find it like 50 feet under the ground with this technology. And the idea is that these soil dislocations, like if you're digging a grave, uh, you dig a big hole and then you'd put a casket in and then you'd fill it up with earth. For decades thereafter, you will see evidence of soil dislocations. You'll see that the soil comes to a
Oh,
certain point and then it breaks, and then there's a line, or um, the waveform will show a discontinuity, and then you'll see another waveform break, right? And in a graveyard, you would expect to see that would happen at regular intervals. Unfortunately, there's lots of other real estate uses that generate a somewhat similar waveform signature. So, as I say, irrigation ditches or backhoe trenches, in some cases, tree roots. This was an orchard, remember, that in Kamloops that was said to be the repository for all these unmarked graves.
mhm.
And again, if you're searching for something in a systematic way, you may also leave soil dislocation signatures that maybe decades later other people will interpret as being the presence of graves. So when this discovery was announced in May of 2021, the media presented it as, okay, they discovered all these graves. What they didn't discover graves. What they discovered was GPR data that was consistent with the existence of graves, but it's also consistent with the existence of all sorts of other explanatory phenomena. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question about how the technology works.
I see. So allow me to recap, I guess, the story so far is that a year ago, there was a discovery of, I guess, what you call soil formations using this technology, GPR, of an area where a residential school was constructed. Um, and the number, I guess, amount to 215 the last time I remember. So that number was
Yeah.
touted around as the number of graves uh, which was being discovered or unearthed at that time, and then he add in the word unmarked, so therefore 215 unmarked graves, 215 purported remains of indigenous children who were victims of the residential school system. Um, of course, so far, as you've said, not a single body, like actual remains, has been unearthed. And so what we can conclude as fact only consists of, well, we discovered 215 soil formations using GPR, and the rest is, suggested, or even, you know, I guess, woven by the Canadian mainstream media into the narrative that fits, I guess, the historical pattern of the Canadian government's treatment towards its Indigenous people. Am I correct so far?
Uh, so I think mostly that's correct. I, I think I would dispute the idea that there were a bunch that the existence of hundreds of unmarked graves of Indigenous children would be completely consistent with what we know about the treatment of Indigenous children. It's
Okay.
absolutely true that there was all kinds of mistreatment and abuse that took place at many of these residential schools,
Mhm.
but there's no evidence that there was any kind of like campaign of murder against these children. And while it is absolutely true that the death rate for Indigenous children at these schools was quite high, I think official estimates are something like 3,200 children, Indigenous children, died after being admitted to these schools. Uh, my understanding is that for the most part, when Indigenous children died at these schools, um, or after being enrolled at these schools, I should say, they were typically buried in their home reserves,
So,
or they'd be buried in an official capacity at a Christian graveyard that was affiliated with the school in some way. Uh, I, I don't know that there's anything in the historical record that there was any kind of like um, system of clandestine killings or midnight burials. I mean, this has all been suggested in the Canadian media accounts. It's like out of a gothic horror movie where
mhm,
like hundreds of kids were just mysteriously buried after. I mean, some of the stories that have been paraded in the media have been ludicrous, like kids thrown into furnaces and all this stuff.
mhm.
It's horror movie stuff, and there's no proof of it. So to the extent you're saying, well, this is consistent with the way Indigenous children were treated, it's absolutely true that the often um, abusive and negligent treatment of these kids does create an atmosphere where people are willing to believe the worst about what happened at these schools. There's no like direct evidence that there was a campaign of murder against these kids, much less that hundreds of them were thrown into unmarked or mass graves. However, it is true that, and I think it's a journalist named Terry Glavin, who's a Canadian journalist who I had on the podcast, and he wrote, I guess, kind of the definitive account of the story for Canada's National Post newspaper. What he wrote was that there, at the time this story broke in mid 2021, there was this restless appetite among many Canadian politicians and activists and journalists to create a kind of new national narrative about Canada, which was based on the idea of original sin, and that this original sin was very much based on residential schools and what happened at residential schools. And the idea that what happened at residential schools wasn't just a matter of neglect, but that it was like these were concentration camps where kids were just exterminated and there were like killing fields, that lent this element of drama and lurid, sort of darkly cinematic drama to what's already a legitimately shameful historical narrative, and that you had all these very guilty white urban Canadians who just seized on this as a kind of symbol of all their nightmarish conceptions of what the original sin of the colonialization of Canada really was about. It's not grounded in reality, but it lends this dramatic, symbolic aspect to what many white Canadians now want to think about their country in this like perversely dark and shameful way.
Yeah, again, I went to university when I think this new conception of Canada happened. I think well, it was Trent University. It was in Peterborough, and one of his lecture halls was named after Cheney Wenjack, if I pronounced that name correctly.
Yeah. They wrote he became a figure of legend. There's a child's book written about him.
Yeah, and I know that one of your country's great musical icons, Gord Downie, may he rest in peace,
Oh,
wrote an album
tragically hip.
about him. Um, and uh, and there's this phenomenon where I'm glad that they don't do it too much during my years of studying there, but whenever a professor begins a course, is this is usually in the first lecture, he or she would start with a land acknowledgement. We are, standing on the soil of so and so First Nation people, and we, I guess, we pray for their guidance or such that. And I know that, uh, I mean, even I, someone who's foreign to Canada, found it quite ridiculous. I mean, but nevertheless, let's move on to what the New York Times article that you spent some length in this article, I guess, critiquing. So the Times piece, which is by Ian Austin, which you've described as a quite a respectable journalist whose work you've been reading for years. So, what is the how is this a prime example of what you'd call journalist malpractice?
So yeah, I'm not sure I use the term journalistic malpractice, though it's this article. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
the New York Times coverage of this was terrible. And not only was it terrible in its own right, but it also encouraged other people to provide terrible coverage. So Ian Austin of the New York Times is you know, a veteran journalist, has written hundreds, perhaps thousands of articles about Canada for the New York Times. There's every reason to expect well-researched, sound journalism from this guy. And then on this particular story, he just kind of lost the plot and started writing nonsense, including one article where he claimed mass graves, not just unmarked graves, but a mass grave had been discovered in British Columbia. And again, even this claim that Austin made was so ludicrous that even the First Nation itself, this Kamloops First Nation, the chief actually went, told the media like there's no mass grave here. And amazing, that article is still on the New York Times website. And Ian Austin penned several articles, one with another New York Times writer named Dan Bilevsky. I wrote an article for Quillette, just kind of going line by line through some of those articles. There's like at least a dozen major provable errors. Like, and these aren't mistakes of emphasis or mistakes of omission. It's just like flat out false information contained in those articles. And when those New York Times articles appeared, I think it had a legitimizing influence on other Canadian media who wanted to run with some of these very lurid ideas about, again, mass graves and other things that have been debunked. And so even though the New York Times isn't Canadian media, the New York Times actually had a major role in legitimizing what's fake news. Like this is that term was popularized in reference to fake news that Fox News and other pro-Donald Trump media had been circulating in recent years.
Yeah, about the election and such.
Yeah, about election fraud and all that stuff. And so here we had, at least in the case of this unmarked grave story, you had fake news from the left, led unfortunately by the New York Times.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the hilarious examples is that, Justin Trudeau, again, me and this podcast is very much fond of poking fun of him and ridiculing him. He went to I guess, a residential school site, I'm guessing, and he, he knelt down and he put a teddy bear close to it.
Yeah, yeah, that was
And
embarrassing.
yeah, and so the indigenous leaders said that, well, the graves belong to Roman Catholic, I guess, churches, not, residential schools, and that's just yeah, that's just particularly hilarious as well as
Yeah, so
example.
uh that's a lot of people listening to this may have seen that image, and it's like just this very typical maudlin, um teary image, Justin Trudeau kneeling, putting a teddy bear on the ground. And a lot of people think that that image came from this Kamloops school, where it was originally claimed that 215 child graves had been found. It wasn't actually. That photo op was staged at another reserve,
Mm,
and at that reserve, I think Cowassis, I think is the name of it. I think if I recall, it was claimed that 751 child graves have been found on the basis, again, of the same kind of GPR data,
mhm,
which is completely untrue. There were not 751 children. The number is zero. There's zero children. And the chief of that First Nation himself, if I remember correctly, said, look, to the extent you're going to find graves, this was a Roman Catholic cemetery.
mhm,
And it's also true that many graves that exist now that are technically unmarked were marked at the time. 100 years ago, it was a totally normal thing to mark a grave with a simple wooden cross, in a matter of just a few years would be, washed away by rain or soil erosion or winter storms and stuff like that. There's hundreds or thousands of cemeteries across Canada that are completely unmarked, especially when the people buried there are poor. The graves of Irish immigrants in many parts of Eastern Canada are essentially unmarked graves because the simple grave markers were washed away.
mhm,
And so if you scan those areas, you would find what are essentially unmarked graves. They weren't originally unmarked graves, but they're unmarked now. And some of these were used as more or less official Roman Catholic cemeteries, which is what this First Nations chief at Cowassis, what he was saying. Uh, Again, they haven't found any bodies or remains, but if they do, those remains likely will be the remains of people who were buried in what were then regarded as official Catholic cemeteries.
mhm. And to revisit the George Floyd comparison, I say that a major difference between George Floyd and the unmarked graves scandal is that, at least with George Floyd, you have a real unjust killing that happened where a Black person was a victim of police malpractice. But in the story of the unmarked graves, well, so far we have nothing. As you've said, not a single body has been unearthed. The idea of mass graves in residential school was merely suggested and woven into a narrative. But so therefore, I think it's less George Floyd and more Jussie Smollett. Um,
Well, yeah, it's just, I mean, um, I want to, I think that metaphor is worth lingering on a little bit because Jesse Smollett, of course, was convicted for perpetrating a deliberate hoax, right? I don't think that's what's happening with the unmarked graves thing. Um, I don't think anyone's guilty of a deliberate hoax. So I think Indigenous leaders who truly believe there are unmarked graves there, I don't think they're being disingenuous. I think they believe there's unmarked graves there. And I think they believe that because they believe that there's the existence of those unmarked graves would be consistent with the historical record, which uh, they rightly say is full of abuses against Indigenous people. Uh, so I want to be careful there with, and also in the case of the unmarked graves, as Terry Glavin has made clear in the journalism, the vast majority of the blame goes to the media, not with the First Nations themselves. It's the media that was just jumping up and down, making up these fantasies about horror movie plots and hundreds of people being exterminated and thrown into furnaces, all this nonsense. Um, that that's that's largely white people in the media, and even in those cases, I don't think those people thought they were lying. I think those people thought they were reporting the truth because all of this was consistent with the kind of mythology that they had been internalizing about how horrible Canada was. So I think it's careful to separate it from, Jesse Smollett was like a deliberate hoax. I don't think this what's happening in Canada. I think it's a social panic. Um, uh, you know, but that's very different from a hoax.
I see. Well, I stand corrected. But
No,
this
no,
is,
no, I don't want to correct you. I mean, because look, you're speaking metaphorically,
yeah,
so
yeah,
metaphors can't be true or not true.
yeah. I
They're
mean,
just.
yeah,
But I just want to be careful because I think like these things matter a little bit in terms of how they're cast.
yeah. I was being a bit too bold there. I was making sort of like a big statement, but nevertheless, this is a story where I don't think I don't think anyone really wins or it's a lose-lose story, isn't it? If the journalists of the Canadian mainstream media are are correct, then we have in our hands, 200 or so actual remains of children being buried who who will most likely suffered horrific abuses under the residential school system. And if the same journalists are wrong, including that the man who works at the New York Times, Ian Austin, then we have a severe case of journalistic malpractice. Again, my words, not yours. Who
Yeah,
were
yeah, no, you're right.
who are driven by again a well quasi-religious ideal view of Canadian or Canadian history and Western history in general. But let's say hypothetically, to quote Ben Shapiro, that we eventually found a site which genuinely contained um, unmarked graves of children being who were most likely suffered abuse under the Canadian residential school system. Let's say tomorrow or even a week from now. How should the Canadian public react? What should we make of that?
Um, I think Canadian media should react. Unfortunately, the natural reaction is to distrust the media. The problem is one of the media's big stories here in Canada is about how terrible it is that nobody trusts the media. So, like, this is part of the larger surreal atmosphere that's taken place in Canada, where the media act in this completely irresponsible way, and then they'll publish articles like how horrible it is that trust in mainstream media is going down, uh, because there hasn't been a full reckoning about the social panic that's taken place in regard to this unmarked grave story. So many journalists still think that they're on the side of angels on this, and that they're, they're think they're very brave and courageous by reporting this stuff, even though the evidence for it seems to be waning. And when people express any kind of skepticism of it, you have mainstream figures in Canadian society who are saying, "Oh, you're a denier. You're like a Holocaust denier. You need to shut up. Stop questioning the media narrative about it." And that has a discouraging effect on on anybody in the media falling out of line. I mean, Terry Glavin is a notable example of somebody who has told the truth, and he did it in National Post, completely mainstream newspaper. So comparing these people to Holocaust deniers is insane.
Mhm.
But the message ordinary Canadians are getting is that the media would rather be on side with these narratives that they've crowdsourced themselves than actually, in some cases at least, report the truth. Now, I'm not like I subscribe to the National Post, I subscribe to the New York Times. I'm not one of these people who says, "Oh, don't listen to the mainstream media; it's full of lies." I think on 99% of stories, the mainstream media can be trusted.
Mm.
However, every once in a while, a story comes along where the mainstream media feels that it's sort of, I guess, tribal adherence to its own myths and narratives becomes more important than telling the truth.
Mhm.
And you saw this in the United States, for instance. I mean, remember there was this whole narrative that said, you know, uh, it's okay to go to a Black Lives Matter protest because you can't catch COVID at a Black Lives Matter protest.
Mhm.
You can only catch it at like a right wing protest. It's just this
Yes.
completely
Yeah.
nonsense bullshit thing that just went around, and like there were people who kind of insisted this were true, like otherwise responsible journalists were reporting this like it was fact, and they were also you know suggesting like that abolishing the police was a good idea. Like there was this whole social panic about police and stuff that, alongside reporting valid information about police abuses, they were just starting to report complete garbage about all these themes. And that's an example, and the Mark Graves story is another example of times where like ideological purity is seen as more important than truth telling. And again, it's not on every story. Like I think it's a very small minority of stories where this takes place. But unfortunately, all you need is a few stories like that, and people they 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 lose faith in the media. Um, and so that the Canadian media credibility has taken a huge hit, in part as a result of this story in Canada.
Oh, yeah. I know that I've subscribed to the idea that the what we'd call the mainstream media has made some serious factual errors that it it can be quite legitimate to say that I distrust it. There are people. There's Barry Weiss in the U.S. and then there's Tara Henley in Canada, where you're from. She
Yeah,
recently quit
yeah,
CBC
former,
because
former,
yeah,
yeah,
and they both claim that the their former employer, which are highly trusted news sites in their respective countries, Canada and the U.S., they've taken an ideological agenda, was a position, and they're structuring this agenda that the people, their subscribers, do not subscribe to. They are much more left wing in this case than the average, say, CBC or New York Times reader. So, but nevertheless, there are many people who distrust the mainstream media and then goes on to launch alternative sites on Substack. I mean, I'm one of those people who are of, I guess, the alternative media, but they themselves hold fervent ideological positions that that stands on the opposite of, say, the Times or the CBC and such. And their relationship to factual reporting is dubious at best. There are many such examples. So, and the audience of these people who would say that they distrust the mainstream media, they would never uh, trust a piece by the Times or the CBC, but nevertheless they trust these alternative sources with with intense fervor. They treat these figures as if they were
yeah.
godheads. So
And
um,
that's a huge problem in
yeah,
and of itself.
yeah, and
So I mean, one example here is that I mean, you saw this with COVID.
mhm,
So there were, call them alternative journalists, alternative intellectuals. I, social media tends to blur the distinction between a lot of these categories, who I really trusted on issues like academic freedom and, calling out the ideological excesses of the left. But then some of these people became like full-blown conspiracy theorists when it came to vaccines.
Oh yeah.
And there's Brent Weinstein is a good example of this,
Oh yeah.
where
Yeah. I was thinking
this
of
is
him too.
a former professor at Evergreen State
Evergreen.
University
Hmm.
uh, in not Washington D.C.
Washington
And
State.
a guy who was like an intellectual hero to uh, a lot of um, principled liberals because he
Hmm.
stood up to indoctrination, all this stuff. But then he became like a full-fledged vaccine conspiracy theorist, and because a lot of people came to trust him as a voice of truth and courage when it came to calling out identity politics, he had all of this intellectual capital and trust that he then translated into convincing people not to get vaccinated, and people died as a result. And so this is exactly, I think, this is a particularly morbid example of of the phenomenon you're describing.
Oh yeah. I think I've started to write blogs on my website too, and I think about another example in this. There's this British radio host, Majid Nawaz. Um, I used to really trust him as well because he seems to reconcile this opinion, that this view that Islam and the West should engage in thoughtful dialogue rather than being eternally opposed to each other. But nevertheless, in recent years, he's made that movie with Sam Harris. um, Recent years, he has embarked on, deep conspiracy theory land where
Oh
he,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, he makes wild claims about vaccinations and the, I guess, what he would call the globalists running the vaccine schemes and trying to control the world and such. And at that point, I just tapped out. That's just, um, I guess, what should be, I guess, as a journalist and media figure, how would you reconcile these two views? Is that it's such that the mainstream media has failed more often than not, but nevertheless, we should also be skeptical when we listen to or tune into other sources, non-mainstream sources.
Well, I think what you're seeing now is a kind of codependency. Um, there's a codependency between the mainstream media, which is just absolutely full of attacking ideological heretics, and a lot of their journalism now consists of attacking people who have dissenting views.
Mhm.
And then on the other side, you have dissenters who their appeal is based on people fleeing the increasingly cultish and dogmatic nature of the mainstream media. And there's all these kind of refugees from the mainstream media who are monetizing all of these sites which have like an explicitly contrarian take on everything uh, from COVID. There's all these conspiracy theories about the World Economic Forum,
Mhm.
um, global warming, uh, the conflict in Ukraine, of course. And so I think increasingly there's a kind of codependency between militantly contrarian and sometimes like just completely loony websites and
Mhm.
commentators who just are pushed further and further and further to the extreme, and then the increasingly intolerant mainstream media, which often just insists there's only one legitimate point of view when it comes to, like, I don't know, transgender rights or Trump or Canada, Trudeau. Give you an example. There was the Globe and Mail, which is a mainstream newspaper here in Canada. You had one of its prominent columnists, reporters, a guy named Gary Mason, just wrote this article, this crazy article. So this guy is, I would say, like a kind of parody of a mainstream journalist, where he criticized a conservative politician for criticizing Trudeau, because he said, when this conservative politician criticizes Trudeau for things like inflation, he's making everybody angry. And when he makes everybody angry, they're going to physically attack Trudeau and a tragic thing will happen. He was clearly signaling the possibility of like an assassination attempt or something.
Mhm.
And so he's basically telling conservative politicians to shut up about their criticism of great leader, because then that will make people angry. And when angry things happen, the country will be destabilized. Like it read like the kind of thing you'd read in communist China. It was just a crazy piece of journalism,
Mhm.
but he regarded it as like a very sensible anti-populist manifesto to calm down all of these crazy right-wingers. And naturally, and then he did this follow-up Twitter post where he's like, I can't believe why people are so angry about my column. Like clearly they're crazy populist conservative right-wing people who are addicted to their anger, which of course just made everyone more furious. And that tweet, of course, got ratioed by people who were saying like, you're exactly the reason that we don't trust the mainstream media anymore. But meanwhile, his article got tons of hits, right? So he is a perfect example of this codependency between a dogmatic mainstream media that's circling the wagons around Trudeau and an increasingly radicalized. I'm not even sure it's fair to call them dissenters, because it's probably like there's millions of them. It's not like it's a fringe. There's lots of people who hate Trudeau and distrust the media now. And they're monetizing all kinds of websites like True North and The Rebel. And I mean, some of these sites are post-millennial here in Canada. Like there's a whole bunch of websites here in Canada. Some of them I think are crazy. Others I think are like, have some good journalism, that are just explicitly oriented at rejecting this increasingly straitjacketed pro-Trudeau anti-conservative narrative that exists in, I mean, this won't mean anything to people outside Canada, but like CTV, Global, CBC, Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, um, you know, these are kind of, and National Post is also mainstream media here, but it's, at least that has room for dissenting opinions like Terry Glavin's. Yeah, it's a kind of codependency.
Uh-huh. I should consider myself lucky because I'm so out of touch with Twitter that I don't even know what ratio means, and I don't expect to be explained why. So please don't explain what that means either. But final question. I suspect that in soon enough there will be another story regarding um, Indigenous peoples in Canada, whether it is of the same nature as this mass graves scandal, or whatever else, the same way that every time there's uh, say, in America, an interaction between an officer and a Black person, and the Black person ends up either dead or severely harmed, then it will instantly make national news. So I suspect that the same story regarding Indigenous peoples will surface at some point in the future. So, your Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, speaks a lot about reconciliation, and, of course, truth. But I'd like to hear from you. How can genuine reconciliation between, between Canadian history and, say, Canadian, I guess, white slash Indigenous relations be achieved?
Uh, it's hard to answer that question in the current environment, because so the watchword for years now has been this thing called reconciliation, which is a nice sounding word because, if you reconcile with somebody after a fight or an argument, um, we do this all the time. Like everybody has fights with family or friends or coworkers, and most of the time they reconcile. And reconciliation has like a good sound to it. Who doesn't want to reconcile their differences? The problem is that the definition of the word reconciliation, as it has been applied by the Canadian media and the political class, and it had for years and years now, has just been this like constant stream of abuse directed at one side, where it's treating uh, every non-Indigenous Canadian as a kind of like war criminal, responsible for like building a giant mountain of skulls on Indigenous reserves. And there's a grain of truth to that. The treatment of Indigenous people has been awful at many points in Canadian history. But there's only so much of this propaganda that you can give to Canadians in the name of what you call reconciliation, before most Canadians, and even many Indigenous people, regard the word reconciliation as just an excuse for another tedious article in the newspaper about how horrible white people are. And you see this among resident Indigenous people themselves. Like, many Indigenous people, and they've said this public, are just tired of land acknowledgements, which are just virtue signaling, where some very wealthy white person, often a person who has more than one house, by the way, so they like have more than one piece of land to acknowledge, is talking, giving some weepy public declaration about how Indigenous people are the stewards of the land and we honor them and we are guests on their land. And meanwhile, this is some rich white person who owns like a $5 million mansion in Toronto and some huge country house out in Muskoka and north of Toronto. Like, it's just completely hypocritical. And all these land acknowledgements, none of these rich people want to give their land back. They want the virtue signaling benefits of telling everyone how crappy they feel about themselves, and they want everybody else to feel crappy about themselves, but they don't actually do anything. And so this is what people now think about when they think of reconciliation. A bunch of upper middle class or upper class hypocrites using this issue to deflect from the very real injustices that exist in our society, including injustices that affect Indigenous people. And so in that kind of climate where that's what the word reconciliation is now associated with, I don't think that there's anybody on either side who has any interest in pursuing this project further, because the whole thing has a very sour, bitter, hypocritical aftertaste to it. And I think you're going to have to wait for the passage of time, maybe for a new generation of politicians who aren't tainted by this cynical and often dishonest propaganda campaign, which mostly advantages the white progressive political class, who use it as a cudgel against any kind of conservative opposition, and who try to cast any kind of ideological heresy as a kind of bigotry. It's a very cynical game. I don't think it helps Indigenous people at all. I think the social panic around these unmarked graves has been an indicator of it. And even if journalists and politicians aren't going to admit they succumb to a social panic, voters aren't stupid. They know that they've been duped on this issue. So I think it'll be many years before we can return to this file in an honest and productive way.
Yeah, I second all of that. So, if our last conversation didn't do it, I hope that this one will introduce Canadians as well as everyone in the world to Quillette, as well as your articles on this site. So Jonathan Kay, thank you very much for appearing on this program. Thank you for being an example of good journalism and free thought and expression. And I hope you take care of yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.